A lot of people have the ambition to start their own business nowadays. And if we look at the UK in particular, more than 1 in 20 people in the UK have already started their own business, which is quite a lot.
And I thought there must be a better way, because there are so many big problems in the world to solve, and there are also so many interesting, fulfilling problems to solve, right? Founders are called the unemployables for 2 reasons. One is they just can't work with other people because they can't take orders. They have to be the one in charge. Or because their backgrounds are so unusual that they actually can't get hired, right? It's difficult. So I think finding out what your motivation is, and also what is your definition of success, and are you sure that is your own definition of success? We don't all have to always be on the same page, but we need to be pulling on the same direction.
Josephine, welcome to the Shades of Life podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, Josephine, we are going to talk together today about entrepreneurial ambition with a focus on startups in particular, because this is your area of expertise. I wanted to start actually by giving a few statistics. So there are many people from around the world watching the podcast, but I'm going to focus on the UK and startups in the UK. Because a lot of people have the ambition to start their own business nowadays. And if we look at the UK in particular, more than 1 in 20 people in the UK have already started their own business, which is quite a lot. Over 1/3 of adults want to start their own business in the future. So there's definitely a lot of interest in starting business. If we look at the 24 to 35-year-olds, the ambition is particularly high among them, because 2/3 of them are saying they want to start their own business in the future. And I think we can really see that today. If we look at an older age group, 1 in 10 of those aged 55 or over have at some point started their own business. So if we look at the overall population it's quite big. So that's definitely an interesting topic for people. Do you know what the survival rates of startups are? I wanted to start with this question because to start is one thing, then while being successful with it or learning from the failures is also important.
Exactly. So the stat that I'm aware of is that 90% of startups fail, which means there's a 10% survival rate. But within those survivors, not survivors are all equal. Some of those go on to be, the unicorns that we hear of, whether it's Facebook's, Deliveroo's, etc. But many, many don't. And so the realistic survival rate is probably actually a little bit smaller. But that shouldn't stop anybody from pursuing their dreams.
Yeah, definitely. When I started my first business, which I stopped at the end of last year, I was aware of these statistics. And when you look at them, you're like, whoa, should I start or should I not? Because it's so massive. But as I said, you also learn from, perhaps something that hasn't worked, or at some point you want to evolve into something else as well. There are many circumstances, and as you say, that shouldn't stop someone.
Exactly. And if you look from an investor point of view, VCs love investing more in second-time founders, because you do learn that. And you actually learn if entrepreneurial founder life is for you as well, because I think a lot of people have a very glamorized view of it, and it's definitely not glamorous at all. And so that's something you get to learn just by doing.
There are glamorous parts and less glamorous parts.
Exactly.
Yeah. So my first question, because I know you focus on startups in general, but I wanted to ask you, because more and more people today are also transitioning to doing business in a way that serves the world more, because we are facing all these challenges in the world today, social, environmental. And so there is this trend of not being only focused on profits, but also people and planet, for example. So do you see that trend in your line of work? Because we talked together in the past, and I know that yourself, you are considering to have a more purpose-led outlook when it comes to business. So that would be interesting to have your view on this.
Yeah, absolutely. So to answer your first question, I've absolutely seen a trend towards what would possibly be considered more impact or purpose-led business, but actually I think of them as good business. If you think of climate, for example, there's been huge investment in climate change, in climate tech recently, and that's a good thing, right? These are not fluffy businesses that are existing just to do good. Like they're very much have high profit ambitions as well. I've also seen a huge investment in health tech. So I think there are definitely areas where there is more of a drive towards I think businesses that actually have a positive impact on the world and aren't just, getting your groceries delivered in 10 or 15 minutes, which definitely felt like the trend a few years ago. I guess on a personal level, so I'm very much a mid-career professional in that, I have a decade plus of my career behind me, but realistically, I probably have a few decades ahead of me. And I've been trying to think about what does, having a purposeful career look like? Because there's always this balance between the work that's available and the opportunities you have, and also the lifestyle considerations you have, plus what do you want to do? What is actually meaningful? And is that, going all in on a job, maybe starting a business, or is it actually more like volunteering or mentoring? And I'm kind of working through what that could look like for me over the next 5 years.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are probably thinking like this today, so that's great to hear from your own perspective. So, Josephine, you are a startup operator, particularly interested in the world of tech and exploring how people work, which is a nice angle when it comes to you. Um, we can say that any new organization, tech or not tech, is created by someone human. And we certainly know that our characters play a big role in starting a business. And perhaps this is where we need to start the conversation. So how much would you say someone's character can influence starting a startup or being successful with it?
I would say it is probably the number one thing that impacts the success of a business or the creation of a business, particularly in the early stages. Again, if you speak to any investors, they will tell you that you can't really back like the market or the product in the early stage. You don't have the data points. All you know is the founder that's sitting in front of you, and they need to be determined, right? They need to be really determined. And at least in my experience, I found there's kind of two types of determination. Either one, it's the founder with like a chip on their shoulder and they just really want to prove the world wrong and they want to be successful. And those people can be very successful and they can often be a nightmare to work with, but you can get a very successful business out of it. But the second, which probably leads more to, our conversation around sustainability and purpose-driven businesses, are people who are just really focused on solving a particular problem, and they have this big vision for a life that could be different and the world could be different, and they're very determined to create that. But in both cases, you have determination, and I just don't think you can succeed because startups are so, so, so hard. And in the early stages of founders, it's incredibly lonely. And if you are not determined, you will not make it.
Yeah, absolutely. Determination is key. That's a great message. So my next three questions are three things that can impact you as a founder. So they are really interesting. And I'm going to quote you for each one. So you say that wisdom cannot be taught. It only comes through experience. And it's important to get exposed to different ideas and ways of being. So can you expand on this in the context of providing advice to startup founders?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've never been a founder myself, but I've worked with lots of them and can very much empathize with the role of being a founder, but also very much empathize with being the person who works with founders. And I think like I've been very fortunate to work in lots of different companies from very early stage to large stage. And similar to other colleagues who are not founders, we've seen things, we've known things. There's a lot of just like good advice out there for startups. But founders are interesting people in that, and this is kind of the flip side of being very determined, means you're often very stubborn. And perhaps you don't want to hear the things you don't want to hear, or you want to try the things yourself before you decide they will or won't work for you. And so, a really great example is like you should not build a product without speaking to customers. And yet sometimes founders will run ahead and do this because they're very technical and they have a great vision and they just haven't validated that idea, even though it's the first thing that everybody will tell a founder to do. So I think, I don't want to put all founders in a bucket and generalize everyone, but I do think there's like just a lot of things in life that you almost have to just like experience the bad part before you really understand or accept that wisdom.
Yeah. I mean, when I looked at this particular piece of advice from you, what also came to mind to me is that because, I did a business school myself, and obviously you go through an education system. But one thing I've certainly seen once I was in the professional life, in my career, is that doing and going through the experiences, there's nothing at school that could have taught me this, like nothing.
No, not at all. And I also find something similar in when I'm reading business books because they're very much based on an idealized version of events that just never happened.
Yeah, definitely. That gives you a pointer, but it doesn't replace experience. And I also want to mention, sometimes you hear people who have dropped from school or university and they go on having wonderful careers and being extremely successful. So again, experience, you gain it for sure.
For sure.
So second piece of advice from you. So you say that you can only receive the message when you are ready. We need to resonate with a message to be ready to receive it. And so timing matters. I love that. So can you expand on this idea?
Yeah, I'm sure anybody who's ever had question marks about their friend's partner, for example, absolutely knows that timing is everything. But I think in the startup context, and particularly when you're working with founders, like they're very stressed people, right? They have, or even all senior leaders within founders, right? They have a lot of different, areas that they're trying to juggle at once, especially in the early stages. You're jumping between strategy and operations, lots of context changing, etc. And sometimes as an employee or, as somebody who's giving advice, you might know the thing, you might know that a project needs to just be killed, like a product is not going to be successful, or that a particular hire is not working out, whatever the case may be. But you do have to pick your timing because if you say this at, the end of the day, when they're not prepared to maybe just think through the repercussions of that or really accept the consequences of what doing that would mean, you can often get a very like negative reaction that's almost reactive. And so I think, and this is just general communications, like if you want to convey a message, you need to factor in timing to your messaging plan.
I mean, timing is everything. That's actually a piece of wisdom I always had in mind. And that's true for your professional life, your personal life, as you mentioned. Yeah, that's true for everything. Very good. So the third one, your third quote, you said that we can learn the wrong lessons from the environment we grew up in or currently operate in, and it can make us repeat counterproductive patterns and hinder our own growth or the growth of our business. I actually find that really important.
Yeah.
So do we need to pay attention to the patterns and perhaps the ones that are counterproductive?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you find yourself repeating this or finding yourself in the same situation over and over again, then you probably are repeating some sort of unconscious pattern. And I can give an example from my personal life as well. Early in my career, I had my first two managers actually were extremely micromanaging, and to the point where I developed habits where I thought, okay, I need to get everything approved. You need to double check everything, 10 times over. And then when I went to my first business where I didn't have a micromanaging manager and I asked him, okay, do you want to check this email before I send it? He looked at me like I had two heads, which is a very normal reaction to an employee who you've hired and you're paying good money to say, hey, can you read my emails beforehand? But I think, we pick up a lot of bad habits and baggage in all of our jobs. And I think every time, like I've recently just started a new job, and I think every time you start a new job or enter a new chapter in your current role, I think it's a really good time to just pause and reflect and think about, okay, what is serving me, what isn't, and what assumptions do I have that aren't actually helpful? Because a lot of the things that we do day to day are just kind of based on like things that aren't even real, assumptions in our head that aren't real. And so I think it's so important to just like have that reflection point pretty regularly.
Yeah. I find it's one of the hardest things to do in life,
Yeah.
whether it's at work or again in other areas of our lives. And this year, personally, I'm actually paying a lot more attention to my patterns and then up leveling, and it's hard. It's hard to do when you're used to do things in a certain way, because if you want to go to the next level, you need to break some of these patterns for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like I'm going to interview you now, but have you found any good techniques or anything that helped you reflect on those patterns?
Um, yeah, I mean, honestly, I do listen myself to a lot of podcasts and watch videos, from people giving advice in all areas. And I think when you are particularly interested in an area, because I think intuitively you know the areas where you need to learn
Yeah.
and are drawn to them. So you're gonna if you make a conscious effort to perhaps watch podcasts or listen to podcasts, you're going to see probably yourself being drawn to what you need.
Definitely.
I think you're going to gain advice. And, there is this thing, I think, with human behavior. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but I think you need to hear the same thing over and over and over again until perhaps you are ready, like
Yeah, exactly.
and then you break the pattern. And sometimes there are these milestones in life when you go through big changes, like, both of us have changed careers or jobs relatively recently. When you are at these points of transitions, I think they are good timings, good times in your life to relook at how you do things, because they automatically bring new opportunities, because you're going to be confronted to new people, new products, new services, new audiences. Things also evolve in the world in terms of communication, etc. So all of this, I think, helps as well. That would be my.
Definitely agree.
So let's talk about ambition, because I love this topic and you have so much wisdom around that. So you say, to quote you again, you say that you wish people were more ambitious and that there is a trend towards a post-hustle culture era. And in your analysis, it is true there is a trend for people to resort to self-care today, and we can certainly link it to an onslaught of external stressors such as global instability, the cost of living crisis, climate change, media influences, etc. We could make a long list. And you are questioning if it leads to sedation. So do you think there is a pursuit of perhaps doing less? And I don't know if we can frame it like this, but perhaps a lack of ambition at the moment for, looking more into self-care rather than leadership.
Absolutely. Look, I'll start by saying I love self-care. I love a scented candle. I love a good bath. I'm not against it. But I think as I was lucky enough to have time off before I started this new role, and I felt like, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And everywhere, and by everywhere, I mean social media, I was being bombarded with two very conflicting messages, I felt. One was like, embrace hustle culture, go, 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 do this, you have to be successful. And the other message was, no, don't feed the machine. Capitalism is bad, go write in your journal, which I do like. But, it felt like, either one side was telling me to give all of myself to work, and the other side was like, opt out of it. And I felt there must be a better way, because there are so many big problems in the world to solve. And there are also so many interesting, fulfilling problems to solve, right? And so I think how we think about work and I actually think what leads people to be sedated is it's partly this option or this whole thing where we feel like we don't have autonomy, or we don't have like agency, which isn't true, right? But it's kind of a mindset shift you have to have. And that's actually the area I'm trying to think about more, is how do we get more people to take more control of their own lives within the circumstances of it, right? Because there are always going to be external factors that impact you. And I really, really do think the world would be a better place if we all focused on doing the work that we are like personally aligned to, both on a values point of view and a skills point of view. And it's just not something we tend to be taught in school, right? You know, or from a young age. Maybe you've had parents or other role models who show you the way, but most of us didn't. And I really think there's, I don't know whether it's a movement or something there to try to get more people to be more purposefully and intentionally ambitious in a way that aligns with their values.
Yeah, I love your insight. I've actually always been a bit in between the two. I mean, I have a dad who is what you would call a self-made man, and has always been very driven, super energetic and dynamic, and created things from scratch for himself, and has been really successful. And my mum was the exact opposite. I'm in between the two, basically. Um, but I love what you say about, yes, standing up for ourselves. I actually find it such a big theme in the world today to be more proactive. That's actually a big theme in my own life this year. And that's also part of why I've created this podcast, to really focus on what I'm interested in, but it's also what the world needs today. And really, stand up for myself as well as part of the process. There's a word that sometimes I see, not often, but when I see it in some LinkedIn posts, it makes me cringe. And
Oh,
it's the word grind. I hate
oh.
that. I hate that. There is a level, it's not like all go, 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 work, 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 and the opposite of procrastination. For me, there is, a balance to find between, um, yeah, growing up into a job, standing up for yourself, going after it, having more ambition, more leadership, but it doesn't mean like going all the way on the other side. You see what I mean?
Exactly. Oh, LinkedIn is a hotbed of cringe, but
I feel
yeah,
like
like
well,
exactly. And I think, look, we'd be lying if we said that everything will be easy. You can't achieve interesting, great things without the hard work. Like I'm sure you even find this with a podcast, right? It takes so much time, so much planning, and it's enjoyable, but it is also hard work. But I think grinding for like grinding's sake is like that's just no way to live.
yeah, but that's why it's really important for people to identify what they love, I
Yeah.
think. Sometimes people don't like to hear that
Yeah.
because immediately they are going to tell you, oh, I have a family, I have bills to pay, etc. But the two are definitely not incompatible. And I would like more people to see that.
Exactly.
That's going to come in the next question. So as per the statistics I was mentioning at the beginning of the podcast, many people dream to start their own business, but never do it. So what would be your advice? How can we all reclaim ambition, more ambition as a force for good? How can, have we more people step up to the plate, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually on LinkedIn, I just, complained about it, but I came across a fantastic quote today that really made me kind of rethink something, which a guy called David who runs the Chief of Staff Network. And one of the things he said is like instead of starting a business, maybe you just want to start a project instead. And that could be, a podcast, it could be like a community gathering. So I think, if you want to change the world, I think, and you think that a business is the best way to do that, fantastic, because I'm a huge believer in that. But I think the things you have to do is one, examine your own motivations. Like, what are you truly trying to achieve? For a lot of founders are called the unemployables for two reasons. One is like they just can't work with other people because they can't like take orders. They have to be the one in charge, or because their backgrounds are so unusual that they actually can't get hired, right? It's difficult. So I think finding out like what your motivation is and also like what is your definition of success and are you sure that is your own definition of success? Because I think sometimes we can get very hijacked by whether it's like society or family or culture's version of success. And this is one of the things I wrote about in that article about ambition was, there's different types of ambition. But the one I've seen in a lot of my friends, particularly when they were in their 20s, is what I call linear ambition, where you are just climbing the ladder and like ticking all the boxes that are in front of you, right? These are typically The students who were straight A students in school went to the best universities, came top of their class, got the prestigious job, and hit 30 and hate their lives, but have no idea what to do because they never actually had to think about what they liked and what they wanted. That was always there for them. And so I think, if you're thinking about, okay, how can I change the world? Think about what you want the world to be, but also what you want your life to be. And then how do you think about bringing that together, whether it is in a business or a project or something else?
Yeah, great advice. I mean, it's also important to remind people, as you said, there is not only one path. You can start a side hustle, take the pressure off.
Exactly.
People started like this without even thinking, I'm going to make a business out of it. And then it led to something else. Because as you say, when you do things, out of passion, interest, etc., that you pour yourself into it without thinking of the consequences and, the pressure and etc., it can lead to something absolutely beautiful, and you're almost in better conditions.
Absolutely.
That's great. So I think you've slightly anticipated on my next question, but that's such an important one. So when it comes to ambition, sometimes we tend to associate it with something that is going to be very demanding, ask you for sacrifice, and potentially deplete us in the self-care era. So you are proposing that perhaps the starting point is to understand where it tends to go wrong by understanding the different types of ambition. And you have defined 4 different types of ambitions. So I'd love if you could take us through them. And you started to mention the first one, which is linear ambition. So could you perhaps explain it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of the 4 types, so the first is linear ambition. And this is, like I mentioned, the people who kind of just chase the ladder that's in front of them, or a very defined path. And I think where that goes wrong, or where typically goes wrong, is like, by nature, somebody else has set that path for you. So it's not your path, right? You're always at the behest of an external force, whether that's a company who's not going to promote you, or, that you can't afford the house in the perfect postcode, whatever the case may be. And so where it goes wrong with linear is that people end up doing things they don't want to do and just don't even think about it. So I think that's one to be very aware of, particularly if you are maybe like a type A personality or a high achiever. It's a very much one. The second ambition is what I call obsessive ambition. And this can be excellent, but it can also be terrible. So obsessives tend to be the people who win like Olympic gold, or who are really, like, I think of one of my friends at the moment who, he's really driven by a particular problem, which is, how do you find the best way to learn a language? Great, right? But the thing about obsessive ambition is it can lead you down one path, and where this goes wrong is people don't consider the alternative paths, or both the solution to their problem, but also the type of life they want to have, right? You can find your life is just one thing, um, and I think that can be very damaging to some people. Then the third is what I call undirected ambition, and this very much, I think, younger Joe felt into this, in that it's a sense, and a lot of people who end up working in startups have this, particularly people who haven't founded a company. You want to do something big, right? You have this, it's like this fuel inside you that I call potential energy, but you don't know where to release it. You don't know which direction, you don't know what you want to do. And these people are often very easy to hijack into ambitious, demanding environments like investment banking, startups, etc. Because they will work, they want to achieve things, but they don't know what they want to achieve. And it comes back to kind of similar to linear ambition, like you have to do the inner work to figure out what you want. And then the fourth is what I call broad ambition. And there's 2 ways this can go wrong. So one is you want to be the best, number one at everything, right? Which one can make you slightly annoying to be around, but also it means you can maybe sometimes play small because you choose not to do the things where you're not going to be number one. Or the second kind of version of this broad is that you want to have like perfect harmony within all aspects of your life, which is just impossible, right? Like your life is like a mosaic, right? There's no such thing as work-life balance. It's like, things will be up and down at different times. But if you strive for this perfect harmony, then you will also be unhappy as well. And so I think, people tend to operate in 1 or 2 or 3 or even 4 of those types of ambitions, but they're not actually very helpful at the end of the day.
Yeah, I can definitely identify some of them from the past, So let's move to the fifth one you are proposing, because you are making the case for a fifth one that could replace all of the others, which is purposeful ambition. So
Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to what we were discussing earlier. It's like actually knowing the why behind your ambition and like focusing your brain power and your time on the changes that you want to make in the world and what you're uniquely placed to make. And I think like people don't mind working hard if it's for something they care about often. But also you will be more fulfilled as an individual if you are working on projects or businesses or creative endeavors that are like meaningful to you. And so I really think the world would be such a better place if everyone focused on purposeful ambition. Because one, everyone would be a lot happier, which means we'd probably have a lot less health conditions because stress is like a huge issue at the moment, health wise. But also, I think people would then focus on like real meaningful problems because a lot of people want to, solve climate change, eliminate poverty, cure diseases, etc. Or, just make their neighborhood better, right? Fix the bins, plant the gardens. And if people actually spent the time doing what brings them joy and purpose, then I genuinely think that would make the world such a better place.
Yeah, definitely. I'm definitely rooting for the fifth. So that leads me to my next question. And, I am myself quite obsessed to being more and more aligned with myself. And it's really something I have worked on more and more over at least the past 3 years, probably all my life, but definitely with more purpose and intention over the past 3 years. And you have very interesting thoughts about alignment when it comes to achieve a more collective vision. So there is individual and then there is collective. In the context and when we want to rally people to a cause, especially, you say that total alignment is rarely possible and often not necessary. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was actually inspired by a quote in my one of my favorite books, which is Not the End of the World: How We Can Be the First Generation to Build a Sustainable Planet. Like really excellent for anyone who's interested in sustainability. And the point that Hannah Ritchie, the author, makes is that towards the end, she's saying, we don't all have to always be on the same page, but we need to be pulling on the same direction to, in this case, solve climate issues. And I think about that so much because when I was in my probably like earlier in my career and until quite recently, I always thought it was so important that we were all aligned as a team on every single aspect before making a decision. And what I realized is one, that's actually usually not possible because how decisions are made are a balance between like power, dynamics, people's preferences, and value system. And there's never going to be total alignment on those. But also, in many cases, and especially in startups or just like entrepreneurial ventures, you're dealing with unknowns, right? Like you don't know if it's going to work out. And actually, often what you don't need is that you need alignment and direction. But what you usually need is like a leader who's going to push forward and share that vision and be that visionary person and aligns the people rather than waiting for everyone to feel completely aligned. And so I think giving people direction is really, really important. But I don't know, I think you have to be the person to do that rather than trying to get the entire team on board sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is also an element of, flexibility and be open to change because you never know, how things can evolve as well. Yeah, that's really interesting. So if we look at the sustainability movement in particular, I actually find this topic very interesting for it. Because you say that this phenomenon of wanting to be 100% fully aligned plagues the sustainability movement in particular, and that many positive environmental initiatives are blocked by environmentalists because they don't accept trade-off, resulting in blocking the progress they seek. Would you have an example in mind to illustrate that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very common for renewable energy projects to be blocked or delayed due to ecological concerns. And I think those are very valid concerns, but this is where trade-offs come. So, for example, there is a proposed wind farm off the coast of Scotland called Berwick Bank Wind Farm, which is currently being delayed planning because environmental groups are protesting against it because it is, to be fair, near some like endangered seabirds, which is very important. But it's these things that actually are require a trade-off. In this particular case, I don't know what the right answer is, but I do know one, we need to transition to cleaner, renewable energy as quickly as possible, or just cleaner energy in general as quickly as possible. And there's no way we can do that without, like you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs, and there's no way we can do that without having a negative impact somewhere else, at least in the short term. And so it's these type of trade-offs, right? Like how do you balance a long-term bigger picture with short-term immediate things? And I'm not saying we should like destroy the bird's nest or anything like that, but it is impossible not to have some sort of ecological damage when you are building anything. Yeah. And so that's one example.
Yeah, and again, when we look at business advice in general, that's true in any type of business, any industry. There are always trade-offs. So if you don't integrate that from the start, there is definitely something inherently wrong, because nothing is always just black and white. And I do understand, I'm very passionate about the environment myself. I do understand people who are passionate about it. And there is also an urgency, like a dagger above our heads.
Yeah.
So I do understand that. But yeah, I'm just going to mention a quick example that I thought was very funny. But I went to an event recently, and there were three companies having great sustainable businesses, doing great things. I won't enter into the details. But at the end of their presentations, there is someone who asked them the questions. And she actually did start by saying, oh, everything you do is great, but why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Why don't you? So yeah. I've heard that so many times at conferences, and we do need to give credit today to the people who are actually, setting up and developing businesses that are a force for good. It doesn't mean that, the vision is bigger for everybody, for sure, but it requires taking steps and trade-offs, as you said. I just wanted to finish on this point with a quote from someone called Anne-Marie Bonneau. She's called the Zero Waste Chef. And that's probably a quote you've heard yourself many times. She says, we don't need a handful of people doing zero waste perfectly. We need millions of people doing it imperfectly.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah, I think what you said there it's so true though. Like perfection only exists in theory. And so the people who are saying, what about this? What about that? Often have very, very good intentions. And this is the same in startups, right? You'll have customers saying it, you'll have internal employees, but actually the person who is building it is the person who has to deal with the trade-offs, because you don't have unlimited resources, you don't have unlimited time. And I think if we all took maybe more of a builder mindset to solving problems, we would all make a lot more progress more quickly.
Yeah. So talking of leadership, to finish perhaps on that topic, you present leadership as a necessary alternative to total alignment, to steer the boat in the same direction rather than being all on exactly the same page. Why is leadership so important in your eyes to achieve better results? And also, as a broader question, what would you say makes a great leader today? It's a very important point.
Good question. So I think we can underestimate the value of leadership. If you look at any big change that happened in society, whether it was equal rights, any type of change of policy, there was usually a few leaders in that field who were really pushing it through. And it could be, like a prime minister who was pro it, a campaign manager or leader who was, really pushing for women's rights or whatever the case may be. And leaders are needed because actually, while nothing is achieved by one person, we are collectively involved in decisions. Actually, you need one person who's completely focused on getting that thing done. And I see this all the time in startups. Lots of really smart people who've done all the thinking, but haven't actually delivered on the work because nobody is pushing them forward to each stage.
Yeah, you need that kind of figure.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think good leaders are people who can galvanize people around their vision, ideally a positive vision for the world, because that can go very wrong in some ways. People who understand people and how to get the best out of people, how to motivate people. And then I think good leaders are also not afraid to take risks, and they both have this ability to shelter those below them from the worst of it, but are also not afraid to put themselves on the line as well. And I think that is, if we had more leaders in sustainability or even in startups, things would work more effectively.
Yeah, I find the last one really interesting because not everybody likes to take risks, but
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
twisted so often in leaders, and they say it themselves. Yeah, entities. Yeah, that's definitely an important factor. So going back a little bit to the human part of a leader, you said that we can see a clear evolution in business where there is no separating the human from the work. And frameworks are useless if the fundamentals are broken because individuals and their ways of being can cause most business problems. So could you illustrate that point to understand it better?
Yeah, absolutely. And before I'll do that, actually, going back to your thing, I don't think risk leaders have to be great risk takers. Some do, but I do think great leaders have to be decision makers, and maybe that's the difference, and that you need that. But yeah, absolutely. So on the point that you can't really separate the humans from work, nearly everything that goes wrong in business is due to a person, right? And it's usually that person's behavior and something they're not aware of. So I can give you some examples, and these are very common in startups. When you join a very early stage startup, right, everybody's doing everything. We all have this owner mindset. And then the company starts to scale, and you can't do everything, and you can't do everything well. And people are all of a sudden not wanting to share, right? And Molly Graham wrote a great article on this called "Giving Away Your Legos." Like as a company scales or as you grow in your career, you have to give away your Legos, right? You have to give away the work that you were doing, and people find that really painful. And this is where I mean you can't separate the humans from the work because logically, if you were to think, yes, I want to grow in my career, yes, I want to do well by this business and to grow, of course, I give some of this work to other people and I focus on other things. But the human side of us says, "Oh no, these are my toys. My ego. What if they replace me? What if this person's better than me? Oh, I worked on this. I'm the only one who can do it." Our ego, our insecurities, all that is always tied up in how we behave, whether consciously or not. And this is like self-awareness can help, but you cannot separate. Like nobody is rational. Nobody's completely rational.
We are all learning. Yeah. I think that's exactly the point. It's being conscious that we are all on a continuous wave of learning.
Yeah,
Whatever stage we are throughout our life, it never stops. And as you say, we need to be able to embrace change, to react to the changes and the evolution in your business.
yeah,
Whether you're a leader or you're part of the organization, it's actually the same from different perspectives. But
exactly.
yeah, I've been stuck in my own ways, in the past, and I've certainly suffered from it because change always happens anyway.
Exactly, exactly.
So I would like to finish on what you call the pattern of missed goals, because I find this very interesting. Not only because to get somewhere you need to meet your goals, or at least some of them, but also because establishing a strategy, focusing on it enough, or knowing when to evolve, as we were saying, is essential. And I have seen many founders struggling with one or more, because over the past 3 years, I have worked with a lot of founders as well. So I wanted to ask you, can you take us through the three main patterns you have identified that can lead to failure? Because by identifying them better, we can address them better.
Yeah, absolutely. So, can you remind me of the three again? Yeah.
Yeah, so lack of conviction, wishful thinking, not quitting. So
Yeah.
lack of conviction first.
So this is one I've noticed in all startups and founders, and even in my personal life as well. Usually at the start of the year, or every quarter, teams will come together and they'll write a laundry list of all these goals they want to achieve. What you'll find is actually sometimes there's just like a lack of conviction behind some of them, and they are work they feel either they should be doing or somebody put it on the list as a nice to have, but there actually isn't the conviction behind that. And if you're not bought into the goal, you're not going to do it, right? And this is why it's so important. So sometimes it can be like a founder just not really believing they can expand to the US. So like the work, for example, never seems to like progress on that work stream, or decisions aren't being made about like a product direction and keeps going around and around having the same discussion because actually like ultimately there's a lack of conviction because nobody believes this product should exist or will succeed. And, even for me, every quarter I'll write, yes, I want to exercise this many times. But the truth is I don't, because if I did, I'd do it. So I think like understanding actually, if you're missing your goals, and particularly if you're missing the same goal repeatedly, you probably have a lack of conviction or just don't want to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the second is around wishful thinking. And again, this is definitely one that I see a lot of founders falling into the trap of. Founders are visionary people, right? They're creating something from nothing. Startups, to use a young people term, they exist on vibes, right? Like you get money because an investor believes in your potential, not because they believe in because you have no results at the beginning. But that can lead you to setting goals that actually are in no way realistic. And I've seen this time and time again with sales targets, for example. So, we've launched a new product, we have very little revenue, but somehow we think in 6 months we are going to 10x that revenue. But there's no plan in place to do that, right? It's just literally wishful thinking that, we have 1,000 this revenue this year, or this year, we're going to have 100,000 by the end of the year. That's probably wishful thinking unless you have a plan in place. And that is definitely an area I see a lot of founders falling into. And I think it comes from a point of fear, right? Because if you're not willing to create that plan or to deeply think about a problem, then you probably doubt it can happen, right? And that's the other reason why goals get missed. And the third is not quitting. And it's one I've been thinking a lot in my personal life because, and again, I've seen it in startups, like it's really hard to know whether you are persisting and actually you shouldn't be, right? Like now you're caught in like the sunk cost fallacy, you're only going because you've already started, or whether you should just, or whether you're giving up too early. And like when I think of like projects that went wrong in the past, it's always because they went on for too long when I knew they should have been killed. Like for example, I was working on this like website redesign project, and it was quite clear that actually the vendors we had chosen were not going to do a good job. But rather than making that decision, it just carried on for too long. And then we ended up with this not great website that we then had to redevelop anyway. And so sometimes it's like just quitting, right? And I think not quitting can be very harmful sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll add 3 points, 1 point to each one from my personal experience, if that's okay. Lack of conviction. 1 point I'd like to bring up is that sometimes you want to do something very much and you go after it. But I think you always know deep down if something is not for you. I think you need to listen to your gut and your intuition as well, because sometimes you go all in and then that's not really what you want to do.
Yeah.
There will be people who recognize themselves with this. Wishful thinking, something I wanted to bring up from my experience working with startup founders as well, is that, when people start businesses or have a new business plan, they are also looking for investors. And they are going to come up with big financial numbers. We are going to do this in 2 years, 3 years. And you look at the numbers are like, what's the plan? And there is no real plan. And it's quite unrealistic. And, I don't know what's your experience with investors, if you have any, but, I would be an investor. I would see plans. Sometimes I would think like, oh, I'm not sure I want to invest in this business. Great to have a vision, but build it step by step, because angel investors or, business mentors are also there to help you take the next step. And I would rather work with someone who is also, has a great vision, but is also realistic. So I think it's also part of that. And the not quitting, there is actually this quote that a famous podcaster says over and over again, Stephen Bartlett. He says quitting is for winners.
Yeah.
And I love that because it challenges you to think about quitting differently. And it has actually really helped me to see this from him over the past couple of years, because I had invested myself in some projects or businesses that were not a good thing for me.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need to realize that, or sometimes, you try a new venture. And personally, I'm someone very determined when I start something. And, I'm going to try and pour myself into it as much as possible to really, because the objective is to make it work, obviously. If you are not determined and try to make it work, there is no point in starting something. It can be difficult to find this balance between the two. At what point do you need to say, well, stop? And that can be hard. But again, I think if you've done everything possible and that it doesn't work, I think it's time to look into it again and perhaps move on.
Exactly. And there's always like an opportunity cost to your time as well. Annie Jukes, who used to be a professional poker player, now she's like a business management kind of consultant type thing. She wrote a book called Quit, actually. And one of the things she wrote, and I found this really helpful, is the worst, because she says, right, the worst time to make a decision to quit is when you're in the middle of something, right? Because you're emotional, you've already invested, you usually believe you can keep going, or if you're having a bad day, you might think, actually, I can't. And sometimes like you can, right? So she gave this advice that you should write, like before you start any project, whether it's a business or something else, to write what she calls kill criteria. So what are the 3, 5, 7 things that actually, if these happened, you would stop doing what you're doing? And I think that can be really helpful sometimes. And like, thinking about my own new job, I was like, well, actually, there's probably a few things that I should write this list so that, a year or 2 years from now, if I'm having a bad day, I can be like, actually, is it time or is it not? And actually, it's only a bad day.
Yeah, that's great point, Josephine. We talked about timing and the right timing. I think that's part of this conversation. And before quitting my last venture, I actually took the time to think about it because, as you say, when you're in the middle of the emotions, you can make a quick decision and it's not always the best piece of advice. So yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. I wanted to talk about something else. It slipped my mind. So we are keeping this podcast under an hour today. So I always end this podcast with the same question to know you under a different angle and to give a creative impulse to the conversation. So if you were a color, what would it be and why? And for any reasons you want.
Good question. So I would be blue, or I would want to be blue at least, for lots of different reasons. I think one, I just like it. It's a pretty color. But for me, I always associate blue with expansiveness and like unlimited horizons, whether that's the sea or the sky, etc. And that's definitely how I want to think about my life. Like I want to live as if there is just no limits, right? That there's always something to learn, that you can always expand and grow. And so that's why I would choose blue.
That's lovely. I've actually always I've learned this expression actually when I moved to the UK, like blue sky ideas, and I think it fits well startup founders. So perfect to finish on this. Thank you so much, Josephine. I'm sure the conversation will inspire many startup founders, people who perhaps want to start their business and can benefit from your advice. So thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was a really great conversation.
Right. And thank you everyone for watching and listening. I get a lot of questions of where people can listen to the podcast. So just to reiterate this, I always put it at the end of the videos, but you can watch it on YouTube in video format and on Apple Podcasts in audio form. So you have a choice between the two. Thank you so much, Josephine, and talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.